The waves crashed violently against the jagged rocks. The remnants of the ship scattered across the coastline like forgotten pieces of a broken puzzle. The once proud vessel now lay in ruin, a silent monument to the chaos of the storm that had torn it apart. Amongst the wreckage, Captain Mark stood, his body aching and bruised from the battering of the sea. His vision blurred as he struggled to stand, his legs weak beneath him. But his mind was sharp, calculating. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The storm had passed, leaving only the steady rhythm of the waves lapping at the shore. Captain Mark's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of life, any trace of the crew he had once commanded. His heart sank as the realization set in. He was alone, or so he thought. A faint cry broke the stillness, weak but unmistakable. Mark's attention snapped to the source of the sound, his pulse quickening. Through the haze of saltwater and debris, he saw her, Jane, a fellow survivor. She was huddled by a piece of broken hull, her clothes soaked and her face pale. She had managed to survive, just like him. But the relief was short-lived. There was no sign of anyone else. Mark stumbled toward her, the weight of exhaustion pulling at his limbs. He could see the fear in Jane's eyes, the same fear that clawed at his own chest. They were the only ones left. The ship, their crew, their world, all gone, swallowed by the unforgiving ocean. The two of them stood on the edge of an unknown land, their surroundings unfamiliar and eerie. The water, though calm now, seemed to hum with an unsettling energy, as if something beneath the surface was watching, waiting. Mark tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on survival. They needed shelter, they needed food, and they needed a plan. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desolate beach, both Mark and Jane couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly alone. The ocean, vast and endless, seemed to breathe, its dark depths hiding secrets they could not yet understand. As the last light faded, the gentle lapping of the waves took on a different sound, a faint, rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat. Neither of them spoke, but they both felt it. Something was beneath the waves, something that had been awakened by the storm. And it was waiting for them. The night pressed in around them, the darkness thick and impenetrable. The distant crash of the waves was the only sound that broke the silence. But even that seemed muted, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. Captain Mark and Jane huddled together by the wreckage, their backs against the cold, jagged rocks. Neither spoke, but their thoughts were the same. How long could they survive here? Jane's eyes scanned the horizon, trying to pierce the night. But there was nothing, just the vast, endless ocean stretching out in every direction. Her hands trembled as she clutched the remains of a soaked blanket around her shoulders. Mark, though equally shaken, tried to maintain his composure. He had survived worse, storms, battles, even mutinies. But something about this place felt different. It was as if the air itself was thick with dread, suffocating. Then, just as the silence seemed to settle, there was a sound. Soft at first, barely more than a whisper. A distant splash, far too rhythmic to be the normal movement of the waves. Mark's head snapped up, his body tensing. Jane heard it too, her eyes wide with fear. It came again, closer this time. Mark slowly stood, his every muscle taut with unease. His mind raced. Could it be Debris? Another survivor? He strained his eyes, but saw nothing. The moonlight barely reflected off the water, casting long, eerie shadows across the beach. But the sound continued, an unnatural sloshing, like something moving just beneath the surface. The tension grew unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. Mark stepped forward, his boots sinking into the wet sand as he approached the shoreline. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. Jane remained behind, frozen with fear, her eyes locked on the water. Then, without warning, something broke the surface, a brief ripple, then nothing. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he saw, but whatever it was had disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared. His mind raced. Was it an animal? Some kind of debris? But before he could voice his thoughts, it happened again. This time, it was unmistakable. A shadow, large and swift, moving just beneath the surface, cutting through the water with deliberate, almost predatory grace. Jane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to retreat, to get as far away from the water as possible. Whatever was out there, it wasn't natural. Suddenly, the water around them seemed alive, rippling with strange movements. Shadows darted beneath the waves, quick and elusive. They were surrounded. Panic surged through Mark's veins. "We need to move," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. Jane nodded, her eyes never leaving the water. They turned, moving quickly away from the shoreline, their feet slipping on the wet sand as they stumbled back toward the wreckage. But as they retreated, the sound followed them, the rhythmic splashing, closer now, more urgent. Mark's mind raced. What were these creatures? How long had they been lurking here, waiting? And more importantly, how could they escape? The darkness pressed in tighter, the shadows of the sea stretching out toward them, as if the very water itself was reaching for them. Whatever had awakened beneath the waves was coming for them, and there was nowhere to hide. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It had become a living, breathing entity, suffocating them with its oppressive weight. Mark and Jane stumbled through the wreckage, their movements frantic, their hearts racing. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but there was nowhere to go. The ocean surrounded them on all sides, and whatever was lurking beneath its surface was growing bolder. The rhythmic splashing had grown louder, closer. It was no longer just one sound, but many, multiple somethings, moving in unison beneath the waves. Jane's breath came in ragged gasps, her fear palpable. What is it?" she whispered, though she already knew there would be no answer. Mark's mind raced. He had seen strange things at sea, but nothing like this. He turned to Jane, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "We need to find higher ground," he said, his voice taut with urgency. "We need to get away from the water." But as they turned to move, the ground beneath them shifted. The sand, once solid, now seemed to move under their feet, as if something beneath the earth itself was shifting, alive. Jane stumbled, her foot sinking into the wet ground. She cried out as Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "Go, go," he urged, his voice barely above a whisper. But it was too late. Without warning, something shot out from the water, a dark, slithering shape, slick and fast. It moved with impossible speed, snaking across the sand toward them. Mark's heart leaped into his throat as he yanked Jane out of the way, the creature's body slamming into the spot where they had just been standing. It recoiled, pulling back into the water, but they could see it now. The creature was long, eel-like, but far larger than any creature Mark had ever seen. Its body shimmered in the moonlight, its dark skin slick with seawater, and its eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, stared at them with an intelligence that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. They weren't alone. More shapes appeared in the water, their bodies writhing and twisting just beneath the surface. Dozens of them, moving in perfect synchronization, their eyes locked on Mark and Jane. "Run," Mark shouted, pulling Jane with him as they bolted across the beach. Their feet slipped on the wet sand, but adrenaline pushed them forward. Behind them, the creatures surged, their bodies cutting through the water with terrifying speed. The once calm sea had become a churning mass of movement, the creatures closing in on them from all sides. Mark's mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be somewhere they could hide. But the island was barren, desolate. The wreckage of the ship offered no cover, no protection. The creatures were faster than they were, smarter, even, and the realization sent a wave of dread crashing over him. A loud splash behind them signaled that one of the creatures had breached the shore again. Mark didn't dare look back, but he could hear it, could feel its presence growing closer. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he pushed forward, pulling Jane with him. They had to keep moving. If they stopped, even for a second, it would be over. The beach seemed endless, the distance to safety growing longer with each passing moment. Mark's mind raced. Could they make it? Could they even survive this? The weight of the question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Suddenly, Jane stumbled again, her foot catching on a jagged piece of the wreckage. She fell hard, hitting the ground with a thud. "Jane!" Mark shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her up, but she winced in pain, clutching her ankle. "I can't," she gasped, her voice strained. "I can't run." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. The creatures were closing in. He could hear them, could feel the ground trembling beneath him as they approached. He couldn't leave her behind. He wouldn't. With a strength he didn't know he had, Mark lifted Jane onto his back, her arms wrapped tightly around his shoulders. His legs screamed in protest, but he forced himself forward, each step more difficult than the last. The creatures were almost upon them now, their slick bodies slithering through the water, their eyes gleaming with hunger. Mark's vision blurred as he pushed forward, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the creatures behind him, the air thick with their presence. But just as he thought all hope was lost, something appeared on the horizon, a cliff, jagged and towering, rising above the beach. It wasn't much, but it was something. Mark pushed harder, his legs burning as he carried Jane toward the cliff. The creatures were close now, so close he could almost feel their cold, wet bodies slithering behind him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. With one final burst of energy, Mark reached the base of the cliff. He collapsed against the rock, his body trembling with exhaustion. Jane slid off his back, her breath coming in shallow, labored gasps. The cliff loomed above them, offering a temporary refuge, but Mark knew it wouldn't be enough. The creatures were still out there, watching, waiting, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The cliff loomed high above them, its sharp edges cutting into the dark sky like the jagged teeth of some ancient beast. Mark leaned heavily against the stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps as his body trembled with exhaustion. Beside him, Jane clutched her ankle, her face pale and etched with pain. But they had no time to rest. The creatures were still out there, lurking just beneath the surface of the water, waiting for their chance to strike again. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The night was still, unnervingly quiet, as if the creatures had retreated. But Mark knew better. They weren't gone. They were simply waiting, watching from the depths. He could feel their eyes on him, their cold gaze pressing into his skin like a weight he couldn't shake. "We need to climb," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. His eyes scanned the cliff face, looking for any handholds, any way up. The rocks were sharp and slick with moisture, but it was their only hope. They couldn't stay here. The creatures would return, and when they did, there would be no escape. Jane nodded, her face set with determination despite the pain in her leg. She knew as well as Mark that they had no other choice. Slowly, carefully, Mark helped her to her feet, wincing as he saw the strain on her face. Together, they began the climb, their hands gripping the rough stone as they pulled themselves upward. The cliff was steeper than it looked, the jagged rocks cutting into their palms as they climbed higher. Every movement sent pain shooting through their tired bodies, but they couldn't stop. Below them, the water lay still, dark and foreboding. Mark kept his eyes focused on the climb, forcing himself not to look down, not to think about what might be waiting below. But just as they reached a narrow ledge, a sound broke the silence, a low, guttural noise, like the growl of some unseen predator. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly he turned his head, his eyes scanning the shoreline below. They were back. The creatures moved in the water, their slick bodies slathering through the waves with impossible speed. This time, they were faster, more aggressive, their movements no longer cautious but predatory. Mark's stomach twisted with fear as he watched them swarm toward the cliff, their dark shapes darting through the water like shadows. "Keep climbing," Mark shouted, his voice rough with panic. Jane's eyes widened in terror, but she didn't hesitate. She pulled herself up, her hands slipping on the slick rock as she scrambled for a hold. Mark followed close behind, his muscles screaming in protest as he forced himself upward. The creatures reached the base of the cliff, their bodies crashing against the rocks with a sickening thud. They slithered up the stone, their slick forms moving unnaturally fast, as if the rocks themselves were no obstacle to them. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he saw one of them, a large, eel-like beast, darted toward Jane, its eyes gleaming with hunger. "No!" Mark shouted, lunging toward her. With a desperate burst of energy, he grabbed her arm, pulling her up just as the creature's body slammed into the ledge where she had been moments before. The impact sent a shower of rocks tumbling down the cliff, the sound echoing in the stillness. The creature recoiled, its body twisting in the air as it snarled in frustration. But it wasn't alone. More of them were coming, their slick bodies crawling up the cliffside with terrifying speed. Mark's heart pounded in his ears as he pulled Jane higher, his muscles burning with the effort. They had to reach the top. It was their only chance. But the creatures were closing in. Mark's hand slipped on the wet rock, and for a moment, he thought he would fall. His body dangled precariously over the edge, his feet scrambling for purchase. Below him, the creatures swarmed, their bodies writhing in the water as they reached for him. Their cold eyes locked on their prey. With a surge of adrenaline, Mark pulled himself up, his fingers digging into the rough stone as he hauled himself onto a narrow ledge. Jane was already there, her chest heaving with exhaustion as she looked down at the creatures below. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "They're not stopping," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll keep coming." Mark nodded, his mind racing. There had to be a way to stop them, some way to make it to the top before the creatures could reach them. But the cliff was steep, the climb nearly impossible in their exhausted state. And the creatures were relentless, their bodies coiling and uncoiling as they surged up the rocks with unnatural speed. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the night, and the ground beneath them shifted. The rocks were unstable, weakened by the creatures' attacks. Mark's heart leaped into his throat as the ledge they stood on began to crumble, the stone breaking away beneath their feet. "Jump!" Mark shouted, grabbing Jane's arm as he leaped toward a higher ledge. They hit the ground hard, their bodies rolling across the rough stone as the ledge behind them collapsed, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. The creatures shrieked, their bodies tumbling back into the water with a splash. For a moment, the world was silent. Mark lay on the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Jane was beside him, her face pale and streaked with dirt. They had made it for now. But as Mark looked down at the creatures below, still swirling in the water, he knew it wasn't over. The creatures weren't giving up, and neither could they. They had to keep climbing. The top of the cliff was still far away, but it was their only hope. With a deep breath, Mark pulled himself to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. He reached for Jane, helping her to stand. Together, they turned toward the rock face, their hands gripping the stone as they began the final desperate climb. The creatures howled below them, their voices rising in a chorus of fury and hunger, but Mark and Jane didn't stop. They couldn't. The top of the cliff was their only chance. Whatever lay beyond it was better than the nightmare they had left behind. With every ounce of strength they had left, they climbed. The top of the cliff seemed impossibly far. Each inch gained a battle against their body's limits. Mark's muscles burned with exhaustion, his breath ragged as he forced himself upward. The weight of Jane's trembling grip on his arm was a reminder of their shared desperation. Behind them, the cries of the creatures echoed in the air, relentless and chilling, driving them forward. The sky above had begun to lighten, a faint glow of dawn pushing back the suffocating darkness of the night. But the rising sun brought no comfort. It only revealed the barren landscape stretching before them, a reminder that escape from the creatures below might not mean survival. Still they climbed, hand over hand, gripping the sharp rocks, pushing through the pain. Mark's mind raced with questions. What were these creatures? How long had they been here, waiting beneath the waves? But no answers came, only the growing realization that their chances of survival were slipping away with every second. The creatures were still coming. Below, Mark could hear the wet slapping of their bodies against the rocks, their slick forms writhing upward, undeterred by the collapse of the ledge. They were relentless, as if driven by a hunger that could never be satisfied. Almost there, Mark gasped, his voice strained, his eyes locked onto the jagged edge of the cliff, just a few feet above them. If they could reach the top, if they could just hold out a little longer, maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to survive. But as he reached for the final handhold, the creatures surged again. One of them, a massive dark shape, flung itself upward with terrifying speed, its body slamming into the rocks just beneath Mark's feet. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the cliff, the stone crumbling under the creature's weight. Mark's heart lurched as his hand slipped. For a moment, he was suspended in midair, his body teetering on the edge of the abyss. Below him, the creature's cold, gleaming eyes locked onto his, its jaws snapping as it lunged upward again. But before it could reach him, Mark's other hand found purchase on a jagged outcropping. With a surge of adrenaline, he pulled himself up, scrambling to safety just as the creature's body slammed into the cliff once more. Jane was just behind him, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her breath coming in short, painful bursts. Mark reached down, grabbing her hand and pulling her up with him. Together, they stumbled onto the top of the cliff, collapsing onto the cold, hard ground. For a brief moment, everything was still. The creatures, having failed to reach them, thrashed angrily below, their bodies crashing against the rocks in a frenzied rhythm. But they couldn't climb any higher. The cliff had saved them, at least for now. Mark lay on his back, staring up at the lightning sky, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Jane was beside him, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. They had made it. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived the night. But as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled deep in his gut. The creatures had retreated into the water, disappearing beneath the surface as if they had never been there. But he knew better. They were still there, lurking, waiting. Jane turned to him, her voice hoarse and barely audible. What were they? Mark shook his head, unable to answer. He didn't know. No one knew. The ocean, vast and ancient, held more secrets than they could ever understand. And those creatures, whatever they were part of that mystery. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence of the dawn was heavy, filled with the weight of what they had just endured. Mark's mind raced, trying to process the night's events, but there was no explanation, no reason that could make sense of what had happened. "We can't stay here," Mark finally said, his voice flat and exhausted. "We have to keep moving." Jane nodded, her face still pale, but determined. She pushed herself to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her injured ankle. Mark helped her up, his hands steady despite the shaking in his limbs. Together, they stood on the edge of the cliff, looking out over the vast expanse of ocean. The water, now calm and deceptively peaceful, stretched out before them, an endless horizon that seemed to mock the terror they had just escaped. "We'll find a way off this island," Mark said, more to himself than to Jane. "There has to be a way." But even as he spoke, the weight of the unknown pressed down on him. The island was barren, isolated, with no sign of help or rescue. And the creatures, though hidden now, were still out there, waiting beneath the waves. As they turned away from the ocean and began to walk inland, the sun climbing higher in the sky, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The creatures had let them go for now. But the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The ocean, with its dark, hidden depths, held its secrets tightly. And somewhere beneath those waves, the creatures still lurked, waiting for the moment where they would rise again.